BBC World Service. You're listening to Newshour Extra with Owen Bennett-Jones. Two things could happen to the world's remaining oil reserves. They could be all used up, burnt, or technology could change and they could remain in the ground. Oil reached $112 a barrel in 2014. Today, it's in the mid-30s. That makes many reserves uneconomic, and some say the price will stay low and that they will remain uneconomic. People used to talk about peak supply, the year in which the production of oil would be at its highest. Now attention is shifting to peak demand. When will demand be at its highest? And what will happen when it starts diminishing? If the recent Paris Agreement on climate change is actually implemented, big if, of course, but if it is, then lots of oil would have to stay in the ground. What are the implications of that? Well, to discuss what the end of oil might look like, I'm joined today by environmentalist Tom Burke of E3G. He's a consultant some of the time with Rio Tinto. Louis Al-Khatib, a Brookings Doha Fellow and advisor to the Iraqi Parliament. Jeffrey Mankoff, a Russia expert from the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. He's in Washington. And we have Obiageli Ezekwesili, former Nigerian cabinet minister and a World Bank vice president for Africa. She's joining us from Abuja. So, oil in the mid-30s seemed unimaginable not so very long ago. Tom Burke, in general terms, before we look ahead, just look at what it's doing now. What is that oil price doing to the world now?
Well, it's not doing something that a lot of people thought it would do when it fell that low, which has created a big stimulus to economic growth. So it's not succeeded in doing that, and that surprised, I think, quite a lot of people. Nor is it undermining the renewables. Investment in renewables is still continuing to grow. So two things people expected to happen haven't happened. What I think is happening is that the revenues of a lot of countries that are already quite unstable, difficult positions, are declining very rapidly. So we're going to see an increase in political tensions around the world as the revenues that were essentially holding states together begin to diminish.
Let's look at it regionally. And we've got lots of regional expertise here. So let's just go through quickly what the impact of this mid-30s price is on, first of all, the Middle East. Now, Louis Al-Khatib, that's very much your area. You're from Iraq, but you'll be aware that Saudi, everyone's thinking about Saudi now and this incredible financial crisis they've got because of the low oil price. What is the impact on the Middle East?
The impact of low oil prices on regional governments in the Middle East will have severe, basically, damages to national budgets, especially to countries heavily dependent on single source of income, such as Iraq, which is around 95% dependency on oil revenues. Saudi Arabia, around 88% dependent on oil revenues. But countries do differ from one to another. It depends on the level of revenue and diversity of income. Having said that, the oil prices on $100 plus were unsustainable. Many talked back in 2009 and 10 that $95 or $75 and then incrementally going up were the fair price. And these are very much misleading. I think with the introduction of US shale oil to the market, that introduced around 5 million barrels over the past few years, have significantly impact on the level of demand and dependency on Middle East production.
OK, let's look at Nigeria as well, just the impact it's having on Nigeria at the moment. Obiageli Ezekwesili, what are you seeing there?
Today, the public finance is in very deleterious shape. And so some 23 states in the federation are actually unable to consistently pay workers' salary because the oil revenue, foreign exchange from oil, accounts for about 90% of Nigeria's foreign exchange. The reserves have declined significantly from levels of about 41 billion sometime at the end of 2014 to current levels of about 29 billion. The foreign exchange rate has taken a beating, so Naira is weaker than we've seen it in historical times, as it were. So all in all, Nigeria is really in not so good an economic shape.
And when you say states can't pay their workers in the federation, you're talking about Nigerian provinces, effectively, the sort of local governments. Yeah. Well, let's just hear. Did you meet Christine Lagarde when she was in Nigeria just now?
No, I was traveling myself.
Oh, okay. She was there just a couple of days ago. She did meet the president, and she was talking about the need for diversification, as so many of these economies so dependent on oil are. Here's what she said at a news conference, saying her team was not there to negotiate a bailout or loan, but it did have something to say.
We are not into program negotiations. And frankly, at this point in time, given the determination and resilience displayed by the President and his team, I don't see why an IMF program would be needed.
That was on Tuesday this week. So, saying the President's determined, but I mean, we hear a lot of talk about diversification and it never quite seems to happen anywhere.
It's been a 55-year stock in my country. There's been an inertia within the political class of my country to diversify away from oil. And I think that it is the lethargy that comes from a rent that's easily available, and not because anyone has made a spectacular effort amongst the political elite, but simply because oil goes through the cycles of boom and doom. Unfortunately, not understanding that it is during the boom that you prepare yourself for the doom, we have ended up in cycles of boom and bust. And right now, what we're going through is another round of bust. And it's so painful because what it means is that many more people will be thrown into poverty unnecessarily. We ought not to be where we are today. Our restructuring of our economy ought to have happened way back.
Now, then, you did give me the percentage number for your dependence on oil. Did you say 90%?
90% on foreign exchange,
Yeah.
But 80% of the budget of
Right.
both the federal level as well as the states is from oil.
Yeah, so that's the same sort of ballpark as Alaska. And we're going to hear from Alaska now because it's also had to make big adjustments to cope with the falling oil price. In fact, 90% of state government revenue there is from oil. In December last year, Alaska's Governor Bill Walker unveiled his budget for this year, 2016, and it included the first state income tax for nearly 40 years and halved the size of the payout residents get from the state's Oil Wealth Investment Fund. So I've been speaking to Governor Walker about the scale of the problem he faces.
It's certainly very significant. It boils down to about $400,000 an hour of our deficit, with what it works out to.
Just to understand that, you've got a deficit of $400,000 an hour?
Correct.
Wow. And I hear you are doing what politicians in America hate doing, which is putting up taxes.
Well, you know, when your house is on fire, you have to put it out with the tools that are available, and that's what we're doing. It's not politically correct, but it's absolutely necessary to start talking about other sources of revenue other than living just off of the royalties on their resources.
And what sort of income tax are you thinking about? Because you haven't had income tax in Alaska for 40 years, right?
It's been about that. Alaska has the lowest personal taxes in the nation, and if we pass all this, we'll still have the lowest one or two states in the nation on personal taxes. It's a 6% tax, which on our federal tax, which equates to about a 1% tax on the income. Nobody likes taxes, whatever it is, and nor do I, but I dislike more than taxes is a deficit drawing down on our savings at the rate we are.
Given how crucial this is to the state of Alaska, I presume you've taken good and expensive advice on what is going to happen to the oil price. What have your advisors told you?
Advisors have told us that nobody knows for sure. In the past, we've seen what we call an oil bounce. The price goes down and then it bounces up. We're not seeing much bounce out of this one. So we think we're going to be there for a while. I will not take the risk for Alaska that we are going to sit back and ignore it and continue to draw down on savings for a couple of years, betting it's going to bounce up.
What is your take on the climate change talks and what's been agreed there? Because people are making the point that if those targets that have been agreed in Paris are actually met, then an awful lot of oil will have to stay in the ground, and I presume that would include some Alaskan oil.
Well, I don't think those targets are going to happen overnight. There's going to need to be some transition time. Someone's going to be using oil, and we just as soon prefer that they be using ours in the interim. I continue to see a transition period with oil, and we're more than happy to make ours available.
There we are, Governor Walker contemplating a tax increase. Only 1% though, so not too bad. But talking about introducing taxes for the first time in a long time, income taxes in Alaska. And Jeffrey Mankoff, we haven't come to you yet, and you know a lot about the situation in Russia, but I guess what we've just heard from Alaska is not unlike what's happening in Russia. The state revenues aren't there.
Yeah, no, exactly. Russia's not as dependent on oil revenues as some of the other countries that we've been talking about, but it's still quite high. More than 50% of the government's budget comes out of taxes on oil. And with lower prices, obviously, there's a lot less money available. And so much of the economy is also dependent on money that originates from digging oil out of the ground. And so Russia's economy this year has performed quite poorly. It's down about 3.7%. And some of that, of course, has to do with the various conflicts that Russia's involved in and sanctions. But much more than that has been just the decline in oil prices and the inability of successive governments in Russia to diversify away from the dependence on oil rents.
Yeah, and I think the Russian government have, for their 2016 budget, they've assumed $50 a barrel, which looks,
That looks kind of optimistic, yeah. And even at that level, they're talking about having something around $12 to $14 billion of a budget deficit. And if oil stays down in the 30s, then, we're talking about a much bigger deficit even than that.
Okay, so that gives us some idea of the impact in some of the regions that are most directly affected by this. Now, let's just think more about what did happen in Paris and this idea that governments could cap temperature rises to 1.5 degrees compared to the temperature prevailing in the pre-industrial era, so around 1800 or something like that. Obviously, if that's going to be achieved, a lot of oil has to stay in the ground. How much? Well, University College London have done a study on that, and this is for 2 degrees, not 1.5, so it's actually easier than the target Paris came up with, and that suggested a third of oil, half of gas, and 80% of coal has to stay in the ground. So that is the equivalent of virtually all the coal in China, Russia, and the United States, all of Saudi oil, and 60% of the Middle Eastern gas. Tom Burke, that's never going to happen, is it?
I don't know, is the answer. I suspect it's going to happen, much more likely to happen than most people think. And it's not just the action of governments that will make it happen. It's also what is happening in the rest of the energy technology world. And the fundamental equation is changing. The risks to governments of failing to act on climate change are going up as weather events come in, extreme weather events kick in. The risks to governments of acting to do something about climate change are going down as the cost of renewables and the alternative low carbon technologies goes down. So that fundamental equation was changing long before Paris. What Paris is going to do is accelerate that change quite a lot. And you must always remember there are very powerful constituencies in every country in the world that want their governments to act. So the idea that you're in some sort of zero-sum game of prisoner's dilemmas and governments will or won't choose as if they had complete freedom of action to decide just misunderstands what's actually going on in every country in the world as people start to experience the impacts of a changing climate themselves.
Okay, well, let's just throw this open to anyone who wants to make a comment on whether the Paris targets are implementable or whether they're going to be implemented. Anyone got a view?
Well,
This is Louis Al-Khatib.
I find it very difficult to see the Middle East comply with the targets and cutting in terms of production, given the dependency on oil and gas. And in fact, when it comes to the gas flaring, Iraq itself flares around 1.6 billion cubic feet of gas. This is an equivalent to feeding 4 million houses in electricity.
Gas flaring, what do you mean by that?
Basically, they burn associated gas that comes with oil, requires to be captured and utilized for basically domestic need. For this, Iraq needs, likewise, Iran and all the flaring countries to invest in advanced technologies and bring investment. But with investments, we need security and stability. And also, we need to look into the setting of the taxation system.
So you don't agree with Tom that it's going to happen?
I don't think that the Middle East state will comply.
Okay, what about Nigeria, Obiageli Ezekwesili?
Nigeria is ambitious in trying to lead the way in Africa, adhering to universally agreed targets. However, when it comes to the climate change discussion and the impact it would have on oil and other commodities that Nigeria has, Nigeria is going to be very, very, very strategic in thinking of how this works. And not just Nigeria, but all of Africa. Currently, by estimates of 2010, Africa was contributing some 12% to global oil production and represented some 20% of global oil exports. Now, that's significant. For the continent that is the least developed of continents, it's not going to be a zero-sum game when it has a conversation about climate change. The universal targets are important, but you need to strike the balance between the development imperatives for these countries.
Right, but basically what you're saying is development, the governments will think development matters more than the Paris targets.
Oh, they're going to think about that. I mean, all of Africa thinks that way.
But let's just first of all get the view from Russia and Jeffrey Mankoff. I mean, we've heard Middle East and Africa not so interested in Paris targets compared to other things. What about Russia?
Yeah, I would say similarly that the actual appetite for implementing these targets in Russia is likely to be quite low. The thing that it's important to keep in mind about Russia is so much of the government's political power comes from its ability to accumulate and distribute rents from the production of oil and gas. It's a revenue stream that the government controls and it hands out to favored officials and corporate leaders, and that's how it maintains its legitimacy within the elite. And at a time when there's a lot of concern about the government's continued popularity and legitimacy, I'm very skeptical of the idea that they would give up their ability to access and make use of the revenue streams from digging up oil and gas.
Okay, Tom, you've got to have to defend. But I've got another one for you. It gets worse, Tom.
Okay.
Because I've got Norway as well. This is Bjørn Otto Sverdrup, who's head of sustainability for Statoil, the Norwegian state oil producer. What does Statoil think?
When it comes to the outlook for the oil and gas and the world energy market, I think we share the view that is held by most agencies, that there will still be quite a significant demand for both oil, gas and coal in the world.
Right. Do you have a date where you think peak demand may come?
No, we don't.
Right. So how far ahead do you look at Statoil?
Inside our planning assumptions, of course, in our business plans, we would be looking at how would the market look like for 10, 20, even 30 years ahead.
And if you take the 30-year period, do you think there will be rising demand over those 3 decades?
In general, I would say that, even if we have a significant rise in world population, 2 billion more people coming to the world that will ask for more energy and to help get out of poverty, we would expect to see a slowdown of oil consumption, hopefully a significant reduction in the use of coal, and still a significant role for natural gas in the future. In total, we would see the oil consumption flattening out.
Right. If you look at the Paris Agreement and the attempt to reduce reliance on fossil fuels and this 1.5 degree target that's been agreed, that would suggest a reduction in demand, wouldn't it? And that oil would have to stay in the ground. So you're assuming that the 1.5 degree target won't actually be met?
Yeah, correct. So I think in Statoil we're taking the view that we act upon climate science. We don't question it. So we share the view that the way the world is meeting its energy demand today is not sustainable.
So there we are. That's Bjørn Otto Sverdrup from Statoil. Tom Burke, Norway, Russia, Nigeria and Iraq all disagree with you.
They are not incorrect in what they're saying about what they think governments will do. And if what you were relying on was just governments to act, then I think they would be right. But it's not just governments acting. What is actually beginning to happen, and I think one of the most significant things that happened in Paris practically didn't get reported by anybody, and that was the president of Renault-Nissan publishing a letter with 13 of his peers saying that they expected the growth in vehicles around the world to go from its current 500 million to 2 billion by 2050, but there was no way that there were going to be 2 billion cars on the planet that were going to be fueled by fossil fuels. And so they thought they would be in electric vehicles in the next 2 to 3 decades. That takes out the top end of the barrel, takes out the high value end of the barrel of oil.
Let's just talk briefly then, before we end this first half of the programme, about the technology, the alternative technologies, because, the general argument has been a lot of money's been put in, and that wind, solar, thermal, all this, tidal, the last 10, 15 years has been tried, and it hasn't delivered enough.
enough. It's delivered far more than any of the forecasters thought it would, far faster and far cheaper, and that's not going to stop.
Well, new technologies.
Unfortunately, I need to come in here.
Okay.
Unfortunately, even though the technology may have delivered, I agree with him. I follow that. It may have delivered more than anyone imagined. However, it is very, very costly for the for countries that are low income countries, and that really becomes a disincentive for their ability to comply with universal standards. Somebody has to be paying the cost. There is a cost involved in adaptation, and with adaptation, you need to have the conversation as to sustainable pathway for supporting the developing countries to make the necessary change and meet some of those targets alongside others.
Tom Burke.
Obi, I agree with you about the importance of making sure that you deliver energy for people and the importance of that driver. But all over Africa, what is taking electricity to the people who haven't got it is not coal or gas or oil-fired electricity. It's all solar electricity that's actually taking people. And it's much cheaper to deliver to those rural populations all over Africa that don't currently have electricity. Nobody is going to build the grids.
I'm afraid when it comes to energy utilization and
This is Louis
consumption,
Al-Khatib.
it's all about economics. Economics requirements and the economic question prevail over environmental priorities. The Middle East still produce the cheapest oil in the world. It costs around $10 per barrel. Compared to other source of energy, it's much cheaper, much cost effective, and much sustainable. The question is how the advanced part of the world are prepared to invest in technologies in the Middle East and other producing countries to help them bringing a cost-effective replacement to traditional production. Having said that, although production of oil is on the increase, but we have to look into the market share. OPEC, for example, 40 years ago used to be in control of 65% of market share. Today, it's 33% market share in control of. And this market share could decline over the next 15 years with the introduction of shale oil and other non-conventionals and renewables. So it's kind of like it needs a commitment between OPEC and non-OPEC producers on this issue.
Now, just let me remind everyone that if you want to get in touch with us, the way to do that is send us an email, BBC NewsHour Extra, all one word, BBC NewsHour Extra @gmail.com, or you can contact us via Twitter at BBCNH Extra, at BBCNH Extra. And you can also subscribe to our podcast. And a way to do that is just put BBC NewsHour Extra or something like that into your search engine, or if you've got a podcast provider, you look for us there and get us downloaded to your device. 1 hour, one topic every week.